Camila Oliveira never imagined that an ordinary Tuesday afternoon could turn into a turning point. As a newly graduated lawyer, her work was more than a profession for her. It was a life mission. She had joined a non-profit organization dedicated to fighting racial discrimination and police brutality, areas that had proven to be particularly challenging over the years. Camila knew the weight of responsibility she carried on her shoulders, not only for her career, but for the voices of so many people who, like her, had been silenced by society. She left her client's office after a tense meeting. The case, a case of police abuse in a suburban neighborhood, had left her even more motivated, but also exhausted. Her client's words echoed in her mind. A black man, wrongfully arrested, whose only fault was walking through a neighborhood where he seemed unwelcome. Camila knew that as much as her fight was just, she would still face resistance from the authorities and society in general. She paused for a moment on the busy sidewalk, checking her phone. A message from her boss appeared on the screen. "Get ready for your meeting with the defense attorney tomorrow. We have an important case coming up." Camila smiled, but then her face darkened. Her job was never going to be easy. The hustle and bustle of the city around her seemed to be a reflection of her own mind, a mix of haste and chaos. To relieve her stress, she decided to take a taxi to her home in the city center. As she settled into the back seat, the city passed quickly by the window, people rushing about, street vendors, groups of young people chatting, all going about their daily routines. There was nothing to indicate that Camila's day would be any different. She leaned back in the seat and closed her eyes, trying to relax as the taxi wound through the streets. That's when the vehicle stopped abruptly. The sound of a siren cut through the air, and the driver sighed impatiently. Camila opened her eyes, a little irritated by the interruption, but soon realized that the taxi had been stopped by a police patrol. The policeman in front, imposing and with a rigid expression, approached the car window. "Good evening, ma'am. May I see your ID?" The officer's tone of voice was cold and authoritative, but there was something else, a slight disdain. Camila, accustomed to the rigidity of situations like this, didn't hesitate. "Of course, sir," she replied politely, searching for her ID in her purse. The policeman seemed to study her presence in the car, his eyes fixed on her in a piercing, almost uncomfortable way. His reaction was almost instantaneous. "You're a lawyer, aren't you?" he asked, looking at the document. "What's a girl like you doing around here? You don't look like you belong in this neighborhood." Camila swallowed hard, feeling the heat rise to her face. "I'm on my way home," she replied with the calm she always used in moments like this. But the feeling of discomfort grew. The police officer seemed not to believe her answer, and in a sudden movement opened the taxi door and forced her out. "I'm not kidding, young lady. Let's see what you're hiding," he said, with a sarcastic smile. Camila, overcome with indignation, did not know how to react. She was a black woman in a country where her skin color was still seen as a sign of distrust and contempt. Every second that passed, she felt her dignity being stolen. She tried to remain calm, but the aggressive touch of the police officer caused a wave of anger to begin to take hold of her. The shock of the situation transformed the environment around her into something distorted, as if the world had stopped to watch the spectacle of her public humiliation. "This is ridiculous," she said, more to herself than to the officer, but her voice did not go unnoticed. The officer's gaze hardened even further. "Ridiculous! You have the nerve to defy me!" He advanced, pushing her aside with unexpected force, making her stumble and fall onto the hot asphalt. Camila tried to get up quickly, her body dazed with pain, but her eyes were fixed on the figure of the police officer, who now looked imposing and threatening. Camila felt the impact of the floor on her skin, the immediate pain shooting up her spine. Her thoughts were jumbled, but there was something deeper, something more overwhelming than the physical pain. Shame. The shame of being treated as less than, as if her presence there at that moment was a mistake. She tried to get up, her hands shaking. The police officer watched her with a smile of superiority, as if this was simple entertainment. "Stand up, ma'am," he said, his tone mocking. "I think you need to be taught to respect authority." Camilla's voice faltered for a moment and she felt a lump in her throat. Every word he said, every gesture of contempt seemed to dig deeper into the wound that already existed within her, a wound fed by everyday discrimination. She was there, in front of a police officer, in the middle of the city, being dehumanized for nothing more than the color of her skin and her presence in that neighborhood. She struggled to her feet, her pride wounded, but her mind still intact. She didn't want to show weakness, didn't want him to realize how much he was messing with her. "I'm not disrespecting anyone," she said, her voice firm, though her chest was still tight with anger and helplessness. The policeman took a step forward, more menacing now. "Of course," he said, his cold eyes fixed on her. "I don't know what you're doing here, but this is no place for people like you." The comment cut like a sharp blade. Camilla swallowed hard, trying to contain the anger that was boiling inside her. She had prepared herself to deal with situations like this. She knew how cruel society could be to people like her, but she never imagined that she would feel the weight of humiliation in such a visceral, public way. The tension between them was growing, but the most distressing thing of all was the fact that the people around them were watching. Some did not hide their judgmental looks. Others, perhaps more attentive to what was happening, seemed hesitant to intervene. Camilla felt the gaze of each of them as if they were spectators at a trial, all condemning her presence there simply for who she was. "That's what you deserve," the policeman said, a cruel smile on his lips. "You'll learn to stay in your place." Each word he said was like a punch to the stomach, but the shame slowly turned into anger. Camilla was not a weak woman. She knew what she faced every day. She knew that the world often saw her as a lesser person, but she refused to let that define who she was. What he didn't know was that she was there, in that moment, more alive than ever, more aware of the power she had. But for now, she just wanted to get out of that situation without any more confrontation. "I'm going to report this incident," Camilla said, trying to keep her voice steady, although her hand shook slightly as she took her cell phone out of her pocket. But before she could do anything, the police officer took a step back and, with a sudden gesture, snatched the cell phone from her hand, throwing it to the ground. "You're not going to record anything," he said, looking down at her. "Now go away before I decide to do something you'll really regret." Camilla felt a wave of humiliation, but also a wave of clarity. She could not allow this moment, this man, to define who she was or who she would become. Every act of oppression she experienced now fueled her mission, fueled the justice she sought. It was no longer about surviving the humiliation. Now it was about turning it into strength, into purpose. With her heart pounding, she walked away. But before getting into the taxi, she looked back and saw the police officer there, victorious in his cruelty. Camilla felt the pain of her own impotence at that moment, but she also felt the flame of determination grow within her. He didn't know it yet, but that humiliation would be the last step towards a greater transformation. A transformation that would begin now, with her in control of her own story. Camilla sat in the back seat of the taxi, her body still scarred by the pain of the push and the humiliation of what had happened. But there was something deeper in her mind, something that wouldn't go away. A growing sense of injustice and anger, as if the universe was challenging her not to bow down, not to accept what had happened. She could feel the eyes of the people around her, the silent judgment. But deep down, she knew that what had happened that afternoon wasn't just about her. It was about an entire system that treated people like her as invisible, dispensable. Camilla took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but the anger boiled inside her, stronger by the second. "I won't let this go," she whispered to herself, the words coming from deep within like a promise. Every insult, every look of contempt she had faced had been the fuel needed to light a flame inside her. A flame she had never known existed, but which now burned with the intensity of an unquestionable truth. She could not and would not be silenced. The taxi drove through the city streets while Camilla tried to put the pieces of her mind together, still dazed by the situation. She thought about the work she did, the constant fight against social injustices, and how those situations, although small in the eyes of some, were the greatest victories of her life. It wasn't just about winning a case, but about building a story that could inspire others not to submit to oppression. Every step she took, every decision she made, had a much deeper meaning than people imagined. When the taxi finally stopped in front of her building, Camilla looked at the reflection of her face in the glass. Her eyes were still steady, but now there was an expression of determination. She knew that the path she had chosen would never be easy, that each battle would be difficult, but she also knew that each small victory built the foundation for something greater. It was a fight that, for her, would transcend the specific incident of that afternoon. It would be the fight of her entire life. She paid the driver and quickly made her way up to her apartment. When she got inside, Camilla didn't go straight to the couch like she usually did. She needed something more. With every step she took through the apartment, her mind was active, planning. She knew she needed evidence. She needed to document what had happened, but not just for personal justice. She wanted this case to be a symbol. She didn't want her pain to be a distant memory, an untold story. Camilla knew the only way to change the narrative was to fight for the truth, and now she was ready to do it. She picked up her laptop and opened a new workbook. Her face was serious, determined, and her fingers began to dance over the keyboard, making notes about what had happened, about the officer's behavior, about details that could be used. Every word she typed was more than just a task. It was an act of resistance. She knew the system had tried to crush her, but now she was rising again, stronger than ever. The hours passed quickly as she gathered all the information she needed, creating a detailed file with witnesses, images, and most importantly, the emotions she had felt. What she didn't know was that the next step would be even harder. After all, she wasn't just facing a police officer, she was facing a system. But nothing could get her off track now. Camilla knew that the fight that was about to begin would be long and difficult, but she also knew that she was not alone. The support of people who fought for equality, for the same causes as her, had already proven to be a solid pillar throughout her life. She was determined that this fight would become bigger than her pain, bigger than her personal difficulties. She was ready to be the voice of so many others. In the silence of his apartment, the sound of keys clicking echoed, a constant reminder that the fight was just beginning. The next few days were a mix of anxiety and relentless focus. Camilla worked tirelessly to gather more information, to put each piece of the puzzle that had become her life together. She knew the battle would not be easy, but the urgency to put an end to this cycle of abuse drove her. The investigative work was hard, but Camilla's determination only grew. She was no longer just reacting to what had happened, she was taking control of the situation. It was one cloudy morning, as she was driving around the city looking for more witnesses and possible recordings of the incident, that fate took an unexpected turn. She received a text message from an unknown number. The content of the message made her stop in the middle of the street, her heart racing in her chest. "I'm with you. I saw everything that happened. We have evidence." It was a simple message, but the impact was immediate. There was a connection, a real possibility that she had more support than she imagined. Wasting no time, Camilla responded, asking for more information. The exchange of messages was quick, and soon she found herself in a local cafe with a woman with short hair and sunglasses. When Camilla saw her, she had no doubt that there was someone here who also carried the mark of being invisible to the eyes of society, but with an undeniable strength. "I was there when you were pushed. I saw the officer do it and I filmed it," the woman said, already placing her phone on the table. "I knew you wouldn't let this go. I'm not just a witness. I'm also a civil rights officer. I want to help you." Camilla was silent for a moment, absorbing the words that echoed in her mind. It wasn't just about her now. There were other people, other stories of violence, of oppression, and she had unwittingly become a voice for these victims. "Do you have any idea how important this is?" Camilla asked, her eyes shining with emotion. "I just wanted to survive this moment, but now I see that this is bigger, much bigger." The woman who introduced herself as Larissa was exactly the kind of ally Camilla needed. She had access to support networks for victims of police abuse and, more importantly, had direct connections to lawyers who specialized in racial profiling cases. Together, they set to work building a solid case, gathering all the evidence they could: the video, witness statements, and, most importantly, a strategy to ensure that the case would be heard by the people who could actually make a difference. The feeling of being heard, of finally having someone by her side who understood the magnitude of what was happening, gave Camilla a new energy. She was no longer struggling alone. The weight she was carrying felt lighter, because now she knew she could count on the help of a support network. But what Camilla didn't know was that the system wouldn't be shaken so easily. The threats started coming in. During a phone call where she was discussing details of the case, someone on the other end of the line threatened her actions. "You're playing with fire. You don't know what you're doing. We're going to make sure you pay for this." The threat sounded like a warning, but Camilla was undeterred. She had crossed too many boundaries to back down now. She felt like she was about to make history. She was at war with a corrupt system, but her courage and determination had never been so clear within her. She could not, under any circumstances, stop. As she finished her conversation with Larissa, Camilla knew that the road ahead would be full of obstacles. But now she was prepared to face them with all the strength she had accumulated. She was no longer a simple victim of police abuse. She had become the leader of a movement that promised to challenge established power structures. As she prepared to take the next step, with the support of Larissa and her lawyers, Camilla reflected on how her fight, more than a search for individual justice, had become a life mission. She was starting something that would transcend her personal pain, something that could impact the lives of many others. The story of humiliation and abuse was becoming a story of resistance, and Camilla was stronger than ever to face it. The moment Camilla had been waiting for with anxiety and fear was finally here. After days of hard work, gathering evidence and giving statements, the case was ready to go to court. But she knew that this would only be the beginning of a tortuous journey that would require more strength and courage than she had ever imagined. Even with the support of Larissa and her lawyers, the pressure was mounting, and the threats that began to arrive were no longer just empty words. There was a movement against her, something more dangerous than any fear she could have had. Camilla sat in a small conference room with Larissa, the lawyers, and other members of the civil rights organization. The atmosphere was tense, but it also carried a sense of power. The file was on the table: evidence, videos, witness statements, everything she needed to dispel the police's fabricated story. The confrontation was approaching, and Camilla felt the weight of responsibility. "Are you ready for this?" Larissa asked, her gaze fixed, serious but also full of confidence. Camilla looked at the file in front of her, the pages filled with information that both motivated and terrified her. Like her, so many other people had their stories ignored. Now she was no longer a passive observer. She was inside the system, ready to fight. "I have no choice. This is bigger than anything I've ever faced," Camilla replied, her voice firm and resolute. She took a deep breath and took the file in her hands. "Let's do this." The lawyers began to explain the next steps. The evidence was strong, but they knew it would be a challenge to face the force of the police force. Even if everything was documented, the path to justice was far from guaranteed. Camilla knew that the case was not just about her. It was about every person who has ever been assaulted, humiliated, or marginalized for no reason. She felt the weight of those lives, and it drove her. The courtroom was huge, the room filled with lawyers, journalists, and even observers, all attentive to the case that could become a milestone for social justice. Camilla sat next to the lawyers, nervousness taking over her body. But she was resolute. She knew that the consequences of her action would not be small. There were people who were waiting for this victory, who believed that her fight would not be in vain. The police officer who had assaulted Camilla entered the room. He stood with an arrogant posture, looking around confidently, as if he knew the system was on his side. Camilla watched him, feeling the anger pulsing through her veins. He seemed to have no idea what he was about to face. She clenched her fists discreetly, trying to contain the storm that wanted to break loose inside her. This was not the time to react physically. The time for action would be through words and the evidence she had gathered. The judge entered the room, and silence fell. Camilla took in the seriousness of the moment. The case was beginning. Her lawyers presented their evidence, starting with the video. Each frame of the recording seemed to catch the officer by surprise, his face contorting as the violence against Camilla was exposed for all to see. He tried to maintain a firm stance, but the impact of the images was evident. "That's a mistake. That's not what happened," the police officer said defensively, but his words were halting. Camilla felt a chill run down her spine. He was trying to distort the facts, as he always had. But the evidence was there, relentless. Camilla, meanwhile, was called to testify. She stood up bravely, feeling the weight of the room on her shoulders. But she did not waver. The courtroom was silent as she began to recount the events of that fateful afternoon. Every word she spoke seemed to be an act of resistance, a break from the narrative that the system tried to impose. She was no longer just speaking for herself, but for all those who could not be heard. "I was assaulted by a police officer simply for being who I am," Camilla said, her voice calm but firm. "But I will not let this be the end of my story. I will fight." The words echoed around the room, and in that moment, Camilla felt like she was truly making history. She was no longer a victim. She was becoming a voice for the wronged, an unstoppable force against oppression. The trial continued, but there was already something different in the air. Camilla was no longer alone. She had become the protagonist of her own story, and the path she took from there would depend on no one but herself. The days following the trial were a whirlwind of emotions. The tension in the courtroom had been palpable, and the legal battle was far from straightforward. Camilla and her lawyers knew that the fight would not end with her testimony. The system was resilient, and the opposing forces were preparing their final offensive. But something had changed. The way the public responded to Camilla's testimony was a reflection of the strength she had gained, not just as a victim, but as a leader of a greater cause. In the weeks following the trial, the case began to gain visibility. Several media outlets began to highlight Camilla's story, not only for her courage in facing brutality, but for the impact her case had on broader issues of abuse of power and racial discrimination. Each report, each interview was a reaffirmation of her struggle, a platform for her to connect with other victims and activists around the world. Camilla's case was becoming a symbol. However, the real test was yet to come, the verdict. The anticipation was overwhelming. The courtroom was packed when the judge, after a long deliberation, finally stood to announce the decision. What happened from there could change history. Camilla was tense, but she was no longer the same woman who had entered that room weeks ago. She had transformed into something more powerful, a warrior for the truth. After reviewing the evidence presented and the testimonies, the court finds that the defendant, the police officer responsible for the assault, will be held accountable for his actions, the judge said, his voice firm but also marked by a rare seriousness. Silence filled the room. Camilla closed her eyes for a moment, trying to absorb the magnitude of this. She felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. There was finally something approaching justice, but the impact of the verdict was even more profound than she had imagined. The court not only held the officer accountable, but also highlighted the structural flaws that allowed this abuse of power to happen. It was a clear message. The system could not continue to ignore victims of police violence, especially marginalized victims. When the verdict was read, a collective gasp filled the room. Camilla felt a wave of emotion course through her body. She had fought against a powerful system, and for the first time, that system had been successfully challenged. The officer was removed from his duties, and his history of abuse of power was exposed to the public. The decision, while not healing all wounds, represented a real victory, a victory for a woman who refused to be silenced. But Camilla knew this was just the beginning. The fight didn't end there. She felt an even greater responsibility now to continue the fight for justice for all those who were still being silenced, for all those who suffered at the hands of a system that saw them as invisible. She was more determined than ever to turn her pain into action. The movement she had helped create wouldn't end with the verdict. The world now knew her as a warrior, a leader, and there was no going back. After the trial, Camilla met with Larissa and the lawyers to discuss the next steps. The impact of the case was evident. Human rights organizations, activist groups, and even politicians began to reach out to support the cause. Camilla knew she now had a platform to do something even bigger, but she also knew that although the system had been defeated for now, the road ahead would be long and full of challenges. At home, after the verdict, she sat alone in her living room, reflecting on everything she had been through. She thought about how her life had changed. From an ordinary woman, afraid and hesitant, she had become an icon of resistance. She knew that the impact of her victory would not only be immediate, but would create ripples that would reverberate for a long time. "I did it," Camilla thought as she looked out the window, watching the city's movement. She knew her fight was far from over, but in that moment she allowed herself to feel victory, not for herself, but for the thousands of people who still needed a voice, for the justice that still needed to be done. She knew the future was uncertain, but she was ready to face it with the same courage that had brought her here. After the verdict, Camilla found herself facing a world that was beginning to recognize her, no longer as a victim, but as a powerful voice for change. Her name was circulating on social media, in the news, and in conversations among activists and community leaders. But despite her visibility, the journey was far from easy. The system she had challenged was still deeply entrenched, and the resistance she now faced was no longer just from individuals, but from a complex and often unforgiving structure. The following weeks were an emotional roller coaster. Camilla began attending conferences and meetings with civil rights groups, where she shared her experience and spoke about the urgent need to reform the institutions responsible for public safety. She had become a symbol of resistance, but also an advocate for deep and lasting change. Her words touched everyone who heard them. Camilla didn't want to be just a name to be remembered for a trial. She wanted her story to be a milestone for a broader movement that would generate real change in communities affected by police violence. At one of these conferences, Camilla met Isabel, a veteran activist who had dedicated her life to fighting racial violence. Isabel was impressed by Camilla's strength, but she also felt that she needed more support to continue her fight. "Your case, Camilla, is just the beginning," Isabel said with calm. "What you are doing now is important, but the real transformation will come when we can change the system completely. And for that we need more voices, more people willing to take risks." The idea of joining an even bigger cause began to take hold in Camilla's mind. She understood that her fight was not an isolated one, but part of a global movement that needed a common focus. She realized that her work was just beginning. She wanted to be more than a survivor. She wanted to be a leader who inspired others to stand up and demand justice. But not everyone was willing to see Camilla as just a hero. In her hometown, resistance to change was strong. Negative comments, threats, and personal attacks became part of her routine. Messages on social media, anonymous phone calls, and even unexpected appearances by people linked to the old police structure were constant. The fear of reprisals was palpable, but Camilla was undeterred. She knew she was doing the right thing, and that gave her unbreakable strength. One night, after an event where she spoke to a large audience of young activists, Camilla was walking home when she received a call from Larissa. Her friend's voice was tense, as if she were about to tell her something important. "Camilla, I think they know where you are. There are people watching your steps. You need to be careful." The warning put Camilla on alert, but it didn't make her back down. She was used to the pressure, but now something inside her was stronger than ever. She had a clear purpose and nothing could divert her focus. The attacks and threats were nothing new to her, but the feeling that her fight was finally gaining traction gave her more energy to continue. Over the next few days, Camilla met with other community leaders and activists, planning the next steps for the movement. They discussed concrete actions to pressure authorities to adopt public policies that would promote transparency and accountability in police forces. The goal was to create a sustained movement that would influence local politics and pressure authorities to recognize the need for real reform. Camilla knew she couldn't do it alone. She also sought support from other organizations, expanding her network of allies. The fight for justice was no longer limited to her case. She was now engaged in a larger battle to change a system that had failed so many people, ignored their pain, and often perpetuated violence without consequences. Meanwhile, in her personal life, Camilla was missing a normalcy that seemed increasingly distant. She missed quiet moments, missing being able to go out without being recognized or approached. But she knew the sacrifice was worth it. The future of social justice was at stake, and her mission was just beginning. "I can't stop now," she muttered to herself as she stared out the window of her apartment, watching the bustling city below. She felt a fire burning inside her, a fire that only grew stronger with each passing day. She couldn't let the fight grow cold. Not now, not when so many people still needed her.